Before the winners of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction and Nonfiction are announced on June 13th, I'm bringing you this deep dive of the 16 nominees I chose to read this year. Hello, Bookworm. My name is Hannah Greendale, and before I kick off the reviews, starting with the juiciest nominee, I want to invite you to share your thoughts on the books I discussed today in the comments. Do you love them or hate them? Do you agree with me or disagree with me? And how do you feel about book prizes in general? It seems like there's been a fair amount of discussion about book prizes lately on BookTube. Some of it negative, but I'm here to assert that I still have favorite book prizes I love to champion, and that includes the Women's Prize. So, let's start the reviews on a high note with The Maiden by Kate Foster, a book I did not expect to be so juicy and so thrilling. The Maiden blends historical fiction with crime fiction in a reimagining of true events. The story concerns the murder of James Forrester in 1679 and his mistress, Christian Nimmo, who was convicted of the crime. The book opens with Christian having been sentenced to death and imprisoned. Chapters then oscillate between the months leading up to this moment and the days following it, telling a story of passion, scandal, and sisterhood. In the author's note, Kate Foster admits that she takes a lot of creative liberties with this story, but I think she excels at giving a well-balanced portrayal of this historical event because the story alternates between the perspective of the privileged Christian Nimmo and a sex worker named Violet, who are both entangled with James Forrester. And I found it fascinating to witness events through their diametric positions and perspectives. Hands down, this book's greatest strength is pacing. Foster does a masterful job of teasing information and luring readers onward toward the truth. And across deftly woven timelines, she tells a story that is compelling, scintillating, and satisfying. If you enjoy historical fiction, you should definitely read this book. A fun fact before I move on, in the real world, the ghost of Christian Nimmo is known as the White Lady, and it's said that she haunts the place where James Forrester was murdered. That place is on St. John's Road in Edinburgh, where there's a hotel with a pub called the White Lady. I'm curious to know if anyone watching has been there and if they sensed any spooky vibes while visiting. Thunderclap, a memoir of art and life and sudden death by Laura Cummings, is one of the most beautiful books I've read this year. It's also the nominee that surprised me the most because I'm not really an art person, so I wasn't sure if I would connect with this book, and yet I could not put it down. The book is named after a historic event in the Netherlands that happened in 1654 called the Delft Thunderclap. There was an enormous explosion at a store where an inspector with a lantern accidentally set off 90,000 pounds of black gunpowder, devastating the city, injuring thousands, and killing hundreds of people, including a painter named Karel Fabricius. Cummings proceeds to explore the life and work of Fabricius while also showcasing Dutch artists like Rembrandt, Jacina ter Borch, Jan van Goyen, and Clara Peters, among others. I was most enchanted by the work of Rachel Rouche, who created moody forest floor paintings of flowers, small animals, and snails, and also the work of Maria van Oosterweg, whose still life paintings of bright flowers and fruit on a dark backdrop are an absolute feast for the eyes. These are two female artists I've never heard of before, and that's one of many reasons why I love Book Prize longlists, because they introduce me to books I wouldn't have picked up, and through them I discover new delights. Speaking of delightful, Laura Cummings employs sumptuous prose to describe a painter's brushstrokes, their use of color, or the portrayal of their subjects. She uses phrases like dew-silvered fields, undulating lines of blue, dancing crickets and sulking snails, and buds on the brink of bursting into fireworks. Her writing is gorgeous. Now, clearly art is central to this book, but remember, it's a memoir, so throughout this stunning foray into Dutch art, Cummings weaves in reflections on her relationship with her father, who was also a painter. Those passages are tender, heartfelt testaments to how art connects people. Thunderclap is a book that sets out to showcase art's ability to influence our views and help us understand the world, and it succeeds beautifully. Even if you're not a fan of art, I'm here to tell you that this is a book worth checking out. I already raved about In Defense of the Act by Effie Black in another video in which I declared it a new favorite, but I need to talk about it again because if you choose to read only one fiction book from this entire video, it should be this one. This book is dark humor at its finest. It centers on a woman named Jessica Miller who's fascinated by the idea that some humans choose to end their own lives, and she secretly believes this act, in certain circumstances, can be beneficial. She explores this idea both in her work and her personal life. She also examines her queerness while navigating a rocky relationship. And in the midst of all that, there's a mystery unfolding. What that mystery is something you need to discover for yourself by reading this delightfully weird, absurdly funny, and surprising book. It's a book that's so good I was on my feet, circling the living room and reading the final pages out loud because I was so engrossed in the ending. In Defense of the Act is currently my #1 read of 2024, and it was my pick to win the prize. Why it was not shortlisted will baffle me until I take my final breath. A good long list needs an outlier, meaning at least one book that differs considerably from the other nominees. For this year's nonfiction long list, I believe that book is The Dictionary People by Sarah Ogilvie. Where the non-fiction long list is steeped in emotionally taxing history and heartbreak and devastating memoirs, this book is fun and enlightening. It shines a light on the unsung heroes who helped compile the Oxford English Dictionary, a feat that's recognized as one of the most extraordinary and uplifting examples of collaborative endeavor in literary history. Ogilvie's journey to showcase the OED's contributors began in 2014 when she was in the Oxford University Press basement where the OED's archive is stored. In a hidden corner, she discovered a dusty box containing a small black book that belonged to James Murray, who was the primary editor of the OED. Within the book, Murray had written in immaculate cursive handwriting the names and addresses of thousands of people who volunteered to contribute to the OED. Ogilvie went on to find 5 more of Murray's address books and began the monumental task of researching these thousands of people. She showcases some of the most interesting people in this book, which is playfully organized like the alphabet, with chapters going from A is for archaeologist and B is for best contributor to Z is for zealots. There are some truly fascinating people in this collection, including hoarders, murderers, pornography collectors, a daughter of Karl Marx, a vicar who was found dead in a cupboard, and more. If you're like me and you've read The Professor and the Madman, you probably think only one mad person contributed to the OED, but that's not true. In fact, multiple mad people made contributions, and you can learn all about them in this intriguing book. I had such a wonderful experience listening to the audiobook that I got myself a physical copy, so I'm going to get even more out of this when I read it again in the future. If you're looking for a book that's fun and informative, be sure to check out The Dictionary People. This next book comes with an anecdote. It's the story of how I read a book out of order, on purpose. Was that a good idea? Well, stay tuned. I'm talking about 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster by Mireille Lee. This book opens with a recently divorced woman interviewing elderly people at a care facility so she can write their obituaries before they pass away. In the Alzheimer's ward, she meets Miss Mook, who claims she'll be turning 100 the day after tomorrow and says she's lived 8 different lives, but she lists only 7. She then recounts 7 lives in short stories, but they're not told in chronological order. I was more than halfway through the audiobook when I realized I had no idea what was happening in this book because I was struggling to follow the many iterations of Miss Mook. I assumed that the stories being out of order is what made it difficult to follow. That made me wonder, why would an author confuse a story in that way? And that's when I got an idea. I found the author's contact information online and wrote to her with all of my questions. One of my questions was, are the stories out of order to emphasize that Miss Mook is a slippery storyteller? She wrote back so fast and was so generous in her response. She explained that the non-chronological order is intended to give readers a sense of disorientation and tension until they finish the whole book. She wrote, quote, 8 Lives works like a puzzle. You can see the whole picture of one person's life only if you bring all the pieces together and complete them. She added that, quote, in a more conventional narrative structure, readers might understand the storyline much more easily, but they would miss the chance of feeling as if they're in a room full of mirrors, wondering where they are and whether what they see is real. In short, Miss Mook is a trickster. The woman interviewing her doesn't know whether to believe her, and Myrine Lee structured the book in a way to give readers that same sense of uncertainty. Now, I mean no disrespect to the author when I say that after learning this, I went rogue. I bought a physical copy of the book and I read Miss Mook's lives in chronological order, which means I read the book out of order. Here's what I discovered. I had no trouble following the larger story of Miss Mook, whose many lives see her sometimes disguised as a boy or as a wild woman living in the woods, other times as a suffering comfort woman or a wife harboring a painful secret. But by reading the stories in chronological order, I robbed them of the element of surprise connections. It became clear to me how Myrine Lee had strategically structured the stories out of chronological order for maximum impact, so that readers will have glorious aha moments while piecing things together. In other words, don't be like me, learn from my mistake, read this book as it's intended, and for maximum clarity, I would recommend reading a physical copy. I don't know if Myrine Lee will see this video, but I am so grateful to her for writing back with answers to my questions and for helping me to get the most out of this delightfully puzzling book. Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution by Kat Bohannon was my pick to win the nonfiction prize, but sadly, it was not shortlisted. Even so, you should definitely read it because it offers so much revelatory information about women's bodies. I've already talked about this book at length in another video that I'll link to in the description box, but just to give you an idea, Eve covers topics like why women have a superior sense of smell and hearing compared to men, the evolutionary purpose of menopause, how some species' bodies have evolved in response to SA, and so much more. My biggest takeaway from this book was the information Bohannon provided on how, historically, societies that thrive are the ones that care for their girls and women by ensuring they are well-fed, educated, and have access to healthcare and safe means of terminating unwanted or unviable pregnancies. That information made me desperate to get this book in the hands of every world leader, politician, lawmaker, educator, doctor, and so on, to make them aware that it's imperative to care for girls and women. In the absence of that information, we have girls and women around the world needlessly suffering and dying. A book like this is a huge step forward and could inspire much needed change, and for that reason, I was stunned not to see it shortlisted. Do yourself a favor and read this book. If you find its girth daunting, consider listening to the audiobook. It's read by Kat Bohannon, and she offers a very personable and exuberant delivery. I'll admit that at first I thought it was a little too exuberant, but over time I came to love her and this book. Let's pivot and talk about one of the strangest books on the fiction long list, And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott, a debut novel that tackles mental health, trauma, racism, and oppression in the story of Alice, an Indigenous woman living with her husband in a white Toronto neighborhood where she's struggling with postpartum psychosis. Alice has an unusual connection with the world. Trees communicate with her by putting images in her mind. Squirrels and birds talk to her in words and songs. And now that she feels lonely as the only Indigenous person in her neighborhood, a voice inside her house is telling her she doesn't belong. That's just the beginning of the strange events in this book, which grows increasingly stranger over time until the book's surreal final chapters that bring the story full circle and serve to exemplify Indigenous beliefs about time. Alicia Elliott said in an interview that one of her goals with this book was to show how, when a person has a mental break, they're automatically labeled an unreliable narrator. And we witnessed that happening to Alice. She regularly encounters racism and discrimination, but since so much of what she encounters is, quote, polite discrimination, the kind where it's so slight it's difficult to discern whether the person intended to be harmful, Alice's feelings are often dismissed. She has no one near her who understands her experiences as an Indigenous woman or believes her when she recounts her encounters with racism. Between people invalidating Alice and her hearing voices, she begins to wonder if she can trust her own mind. In the midst of all of that, Alice is attempting to write her own version of the Haudenosaunee creation story of Sky Woman, which is woven throughout the book and parallels her own story. She also struggles to connect with her newborn daughter, and she makes keen observations about herself and her white husband. For example, he inherited generational wealth, whereas she inherited generational trauma. If you're interested in a somber and surreal story that's adorned with Indigenous lore and features a talking cockroach, then you need to check this one out. Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World opens with author Naomi Klein saying this is not going to be a memoir in which she obsesses about her doppelganger, Naomi Wolf. She then proceeds to obsess about her for 350 pages. In all seriousness, I have mixed feelings about this book. To provide some context, Naomi Klein is an accomplished leftist author, professor, and social activist who is regularly confused online with Naomi Wolf, a right-wing conspiracist and anti-vaxxer. This led Klein to deep dive into Wolf's world of right-wing politics, conspiracy theories, and strategic misinformation. I think three of the most important revelations she makes in this book are: 1, right-wing politicians and pundits' proclivity to flip the script anytime they're at risk of having their egregious or corrupt behavior exposed. They intentionally accuse the other party of the same behavior, thereby distracting their constituents. 2, concerted efforts by right-wing figures to undermine or dissolve the potency of important words like genocide or Holocaust. And 3, Klein highlights how Democrats are continually dividing into smaller and smaller groups because of minor differences, thereby weakening the party to everyone's detriment. After providing all of this concerning information, she offers a call to action, but it amounts to little more than stressing that 1, we need to name systems that carved out these realms of conspiracy and misinformation, and 2, recognize that we need to collaborate to fix this problem. It begs so many questions like, how do we go about doing that? Where do we do it? What are some first steps toward overcoming our differences? To me, it felt like a limp call to action with no follow-through. And maybe because I'm American, this all felt like old news. I'd love to know if you're a reader living outside of the States, if this book was mind-blowing and eye-opening for you. Was this all new information for you? Now, clearly, this is an important book. I understand why it was longlisted, but if I'm being honest, I'm disappointed that it was shortlisted simply because that means more people will be likely to read it instead of a book like Eve. And it pains me to think of people spending time absorbing more of Naomi Wolf's nonsensical spewings when they could be learning about women's bodies and the importance of ensuring the well-being of girls and women, which we desperately need the world over. And finally, I think Doppelganger's greatest flaw is that Klein's writing style is so elevated that the American people who most need to read this book will likely find it inaccessible, and that's a shame. I have rhapsodized about Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshanathan in not one but 2 booktube videos, so I'll keep this short, but I'm also going to share some things about this book that I didn't discuss in my previous videos. Briefly, this is historical fiction about 16-year-old Sashi who's aspiring to become a doctor in 1980s Jaffna, but soon finds herself and her family caught up in the Sri Lankan Civil War, which lasted for 26 years. Sashi's story is so deeply affecting that I feel like I know her. She's a fictional character, but I find myself thinking about her on occasion and wondering, like, how is she doing and hoping that she's okay, which is a testament to Ganesh Ananthan's talent as a writer. There's supplementary material at the back of the book, which includes an interview from the author talking about her experience researching and writing this book. There's an extensive list of recommended reading to further one's understanding of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and there's a list of book club discussion questions. I'm extremely grateful to the Carol Shields Prize, which is like the US and Canada's equivalent of the UK Women's Prize, for sending me this year's shortlist, which included this book. I'll post a link to that review video in the description box in case you'd like to hear more about Brotherless Night. High on my list of the most enjoyable nonfiction reads is Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life by Anna Funder. This book is a tapestry of memoir, biography, letters, essays, and fiction concerning George Orwell and his first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, the woman whose unsung contributions to his work on Animal Farm in 1984 arguably played a significant role in his success as a writer. Anna Funder's journey to draw Eileen out of obscurity began in 2017 when, as a working wife and mother, she reached peak overload and sought refuge in a secondhand bookshop. There, she discovered a 4-volume series of George Orwell's collected works, which jettisoned her into a deep dive of the Orwell couple's life. While highlighting the significant role Eileen played in bolstering George's career as a writer, she also scrutinizes the unappreciated role women and wives have played throughout history in supporting their husbands. She also exposes George Orwell's predatory behavior and the many ways in which he neglected his wife. Woven throughout all of that are brief interludes where Anna Funder reflects on her own life and offers social commentary on patriarchy, misogyny, and wifedom. I loved listening to this audiobook, but I would recommend reading a physical copy. I think that would have made it easier to follow all of the small pieces that make up this book, and that way you won't miss out on the pictures like I did. This is definitely a book I'm looking forward to reading again someday. This next book is a cautionary tale about the dangers of imposing one's expectations on a book instead of letting it be what it is. I'm talking about my personal failings when reading Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. Now, first and foremost, I am so grateful to Shelley Swearingen for buddy reading this book with me. She is so lovely, and she posts content on her channel with admirable regularity. I don't know how she's able to post so frequently and bring such warmth and levity to everything she does. I'll link to her thoughts on this book in the description box. Puzzling over this book with Shelley helped me realize why it wasn't quite working for me, but also I came to appreciate what it gets right. Ordinary Human Failings is a literary psychological thriller that opens with the disappearance of 3-year-old Mia. Frantic neighbors spread the news and rumors swirl that the reclusive Green family may have had something to do with Mia's disappearance. We're then introduced to Carmel, whose 10-year-old daughter Lucy was among the children last seen playing with Mia. At the start of the book, while everyone's looking for Mia, Carmel is at a cafe reminiscing about an old love affair. So right out the gate, something about her feels off. At first, I thought Carmel was developmentally handicapped. Later, I assumed she had a low EQ. But ultimately, I'm not sure if I ever figured her out. Like, if you've read this book, please weigh in on this character and tell me what you think of her. How do you explain her fixations and aloofness? Is it emotional detachment, a coping mechanism, or something else? Now, after Carmel, we're introduced to Tom, the fierce reporter who thinks he's superior to his readers. He happens upon Mia's story early on and ingratiates himself with the neighbors to get the scoop before other publications do. Tom is my favorite character in this book. He's awful and cunning, and that makes him really fun to watch. Unfortunately, the blurb makes it seem like the story will center on Tom, but He's merely the lens through which we're introduced to the Greens, whose background stories make up the majority of the book. My big failing was picking up this book thinking it would be a tense mystery thriller that closely follows the case, but that's not what this is. Instead, the story explores the lives of the individual members of the Green family, revealing how they are ordinary, flawed humans. If you enjoy in-depth character studies with quiet resolution, then this is the book for you. The book I identified with the most is How to Say Babylon by Sophia Sinclair. This is a lyrically written memoir in which Sinclair recounts her experience growing up with an abusive religious father. Her father became a devout follower of the religious and political Rastafari movement, which then dictated her entire upbringing. This is not an easy book to read. There are some very graphic descriptions of abuse in here, but I appreciate that it's a necessary component of Sinclair providing an accurate portrayal of what it feels like to be captive in a household with an abusive figurehead. I also admire her vulnerability in this book. She shares how her father devalued her, made her feel small, stood in the way of her education, and how he imposed on her his idea of what her future should be. She also examines how abuse shapes a victim's self-worth and identity, highlights the lingering impact of abuse, and also touches on a child's natural desire to be loved and seen by a parent, even when that parent is hurting them. As someone who can relate to her experience, I think she just nails it. She also writes beautifully about her relationship with her mother and touches on the continued legacy of colonialism in her hometown of Montego Bay, Jamaica. There's a lot to unpack here. I talked about all of it at length in a previous video that I'll link to in the description box. If you've read this book, I'm curious to know how you feel about the ending and where Sinclair's relationship with her father stands, because I really had a hard time with it. If you're looking to read something that will solidify your decision to remain child-free, then have I got a book for you. Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy drops us into the mind of a woman who's struggling with new motherhood. She's also resentful of her husband because she's painfully aware of how women's bodies, lives, and identities are impacted by parenthood to a much greater extent than for men. The story is conveyed through the mother speaking to her son, recounting the endless array of hurdles she faces as a new mother. One day, she unexpectedly sees an old friend at a park who is also a new parent, and that friend becomes a point of comparison between who she used to be versus who she is now, as well as the state of her marriage and how she's doing as a parent. And what I like most about this book is Kilroy's efficient yet emotional writing. She so effectively conveys the stress of being a parent that I was wincing, cringing, and clenching my jaw the entire time I read this book. Like, the tension never lets up, and after I read the final page, I felt emotionally drained and exhausted. If I could gripe about one thing in this book, it's that I think the protagonist's important observations about how men and women experience parenthood differently could have been stronger and better received if she had demonstrated stronger communication skills and showed less of an emotional intelligence deficit. One final note is that this book has a lot in common with And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott, so if you loved one, consider reading the other if you're in the mood for more fiction that centers on the difficulties of being a new mother. This year's fiction nominee outlier is The Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. The most baffling things about this book is that the judges failed to mention it's the third book in a series, and they pitched it as a climate change book, even though it really has nothing to do with climate change. It was such a misrepresentation of this book, and I think they did a disservice to Karen Lord. I would love to know what happened there, what went wrong. If you have any insights on that, please let me know. As for the book itself, the story primarily concerns a group of people preparing to make first contact with intelligent civilizations beyond Earth with the intent of establishing formal relationships with them. When contact is finally made, it is so underwhelming and mostly happens off stage. It's not a story of first contact so much as a quiet interrogation of a possible future in which we all communicate through virtual reality. It suggests that only seeing ourselves represented digitally means we rarely, if ever, see each other authentically. Reviewers on Goodreads who have read the first two books appear to really like how this book wraps up a series, but as someone who went into it expecting a climate change book and not realizing it was part of a series, I was so lost. In short, if this book's premise intrigues you, then consider starting with The Best of All Possible Worlds, which is the first book in the series. Now we get to the two books that defeated me, starting with A Flat Place by Noreen Masood. This is a memoir in which Masood draws parallels between flat landscapes in various places and the flatness she feels inside as a result of trauma. She journeys across landscapes as a way of processing relational trauma in hopes of softening a world that feels spiky and strange. Now, I made it about 60 pages into this 200-page book before I decided to set it aside, simply because Masood circles back to compare people and feelings and objects to landscapes so frequently that it felt redundant. Note that I am an outlier in this regard. The overwhelming majority of people love this book. Like 46% of reviewers on Goodreads have given it 5 stars. I think it's possible this book and I just met at the wrong time. I'd already read about so much trauma by the time I picked it up. Perhaps my patience had run thin. So please consider other reviewers' opinions of this book before deciding if it's the right book for you. The second book I DNF'd was The Wren by Anne Enright. It wasn't the right book for me, but let's see if it's the right book for you. The story concerns 3 generations of women whose lives are affected by a family member, a famous Irish poet named Phil McDarragh, who abandoned his sick wife and 2 young daughters, an action that has a trickle-down effect all the way to his granddaughter. Each chapter is told from the perspective of a different member of the McDarragh family, beginning with Phil's granddaughter, Nell, for whom Phil's poetry is akin to a compass in her life. And we're then introduced to Nell's mother, Carmel, who feels deeply betrayed by her father's abandonment. This is said to be a story of trauma and love, as well as disillusionment. I appreciated the writing style, but I found it difficult to connect with the characters. And I've seen a lot of reviewers say there's no plot, so maybe that's why. But I'm holding on to both of these books in case I want to give them another chance in the future. And they've both been shortlisted. And certainly if they win, I'll be very curious to read them. Women's Prize season is my favorite bookish time of the year. I love being part of what feels like the world's biggest book club. And I have to say, I was so pleased with the type of books that were nominated for this year's nonfiction prize that I might be more excited about next year's nonfiction longlist than I am for the fiction longlist. And I'm curious to know what you think. Like, which longlist, fiction or nonfiction, are you most excited for next year? Thank you so much for joining me today. I wish you happy reading, and I'll see you in the next one.